We're going to shift gears a little bit from spike protein entry to market entry, and from certain helical structures to debt financing structures. So this morning you're getting the full scope, the full cascade here. And I will be sharing with you how we think about this at the Bill and Melinda Gates Medical Research Institute, how we think about turning vaccines into vaccinations, as Kendall and Ford opened with. We'll walk through some of the basics at a high level of market access and certain financing considerations, take you through the case example of tuberculosis, which I know has been a priority of the Dartmouth research community for a long time, and then talk a bit about market access and financing considerations. So, who are we? You might have heard of our parent organization, a small family foundation based out in Seattle, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. We were spun out essentially about 5.5 years ago to really be a pharmaceutical operating entity that is financed by the Gates Foundation, but we look and act like a pharmaceutical company with the exception that we are a nonprofit. So you will not find a sales and marketing team in our organization. Instead, you'll find researchers and operators acting at this intersection of global health pharmaceutical development. So our CEO, who I know many of you here know, Emilio Amini, came from the pharmaceutical industry, as does our entire staff, basically. So if you look inside our organization, you won't really see much of a difference in terms of our staff breakdown between our organization and a Merck or a Pfizer or a GSK. We work through contract research organizations and contract manufacturing organizations to drive the full spectrum of pharmaceutical development from preclinical through phase 3 and registration. We will not ultimately be the market authorization holders for our products. We will work with partners over the course of the development cycle to enable them to enter the marketplace. But as I mentioned, we're not in the business of sales and marketing. We will work with our partners to do that. We are largely financed by the Gates Foundation, hence our name. We also have funding from the Wellcome Trust in the UK. So what exactly do we tackle? What is our strategy? Well, we work within in alignment with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation's Global Health Division. And we also see our comparative advantage in this ecosystem as being at the intersection of big global health burden or unaddressed global health burden or under-addressed global health burden and limited commercial incentives. Where can we go that we think maybe a product or an asset or an area may be ignored for some time or may not be able to be advanced in the way that it needs to be advanced? So that brings us to our disease areas. What is in that Venn diagram? A lot of the diseases here you'll recognize and will be obvious to you: malaria, tuberculosis, diarrheal diseases, and maternal, newborn, and child health. On the far right, you'll see our portfolio. We have a sizable TB therapeutics portfolio. Some of you in here are even involved in that in various ways. We have a tuberculosis vaccines program, 2 different vaccines. We have a Shigella vaccine program, malaria monoclonal antibody, and an infant probiotic for malnutrition, and some work we're starting with RSV. So inside our organization, as I mentioned, we're structured like other pharmaceutical companies would be structured. We have, where's the little clicker guy? There it is. We have clinical development, quality assurance, chemistry, manufacturing controls, discovery and toxicology, program management, portfolio management, regulatory, and then we're set up with these enabling functions down on the bottom. This is a pretty standard setup for a pharmaceutical organization, and we mirror that. So at this intersection of global health and market access, how do we think about solving these problems? And what is market access? We'll just start there. Market access, as we understand it, is the suite of activities that's required to bring a product from the clinic to the people. And we just heard this amazing lecture about Samuel Katz and the work that was done to turn the measles vaccine into a vaccination program. And you saw those incredible graphs driving down disease and in a sustained way over time. And so we think about market access in that way too. How do you ensure that that product gets there and you can ensure rapid and sustained access and availability to the product? And for us, this means working very closely with our partners. So this is a generic product agnostic slide that is meant to be translatable across different product types. So not necessarily for vaccines, but some of the issues that you'd think about while you are developing a certain asset. So when you're doing your due diligence, when you're thinking about bringing on an asset, let's say it's before you even make that initial investment, before you even in-license your asset, you're thinking about what's the total market? What market can I reach? What is the global policy landscape? Is there even a pathway to this product being accessible and available at the end of the day? So those are some of the early questions to make sure to be asking. Then secondly, as you move into activity set 2, which roughly, this is all rough and meant to be translatable, but roughly in preclinical through phase 2, you're wanting to refine those early activities. What does that demand forecast look like? And we all know that there's one thing that's true about demand forecasts, that they're never right. But you want to start refining that and testing your assumptions and going out into the field and asking those tough questions around, how will this product be accepted? Is there a market for this? Will we need to think about, patches, like Jason was saying, instead of needles, syringes? So you want to pressure test all of those assumptions that you did up front in your due diligence and put together that business plan, as Kendall was talking about, and start to think about that end user segmentation. And then in your activity set 3, this is where the rubber starts meeting the road a little bit. You're starting to make those decisions around pricing. You're working in your cost of goods analyses. You're thinking about impact assessments, market positioning. Who are your early adopters going to be, and what are those bottlenecks? Where are you going to meet resistance at the global level, at the country level, at the regional level, at the local level, and start to really think critically about that actual introduction. Activity set 4 we won't get into much today, but it's really the post-market work. So post-market surveillance, the continued demand generation, cost-effectiveness analyses, and some of these things are done up front. And would continue to be done in post-market. But 2 things I'll just note here. One is that these are all interrelated. And so the awareness that the post-market surveillance is going to be done in your later stage of your development work and post-launch the awareness needs to be upfront. So you're going to need to think about that upfront. And the second point is that some of these things are critical path. There is in your development, your clinical development cycle, you always talk about the critical path for the clinical development. There's also a critical path for access. You can't pass go and collect your $200 unless you get that WHO policy recommendation. You can't do XYZ unless you've done ABC. And so there are some critical path elements here, which I won't go into too much detail on today, but is something to really keep in mind. So I'll use the case example of TB for 2 reasons. One, because it's an area that I know Dartmouth has been very involved in, and I know Ford has spent many years working on with your colleagues here. And I had the opportunity to see Dartmouth's clinical trial site when I was a student here working with Lisa Adams, and was really inspired by that experience, and no doubt led me down this path. The second reason is that this is a really huge burden of disease and still persists today. So it's a good example, I think, for us to apply some of these considerations around turning vaccines into vaccinations. So many of you will be familiar with these data. TB disease continues to claim 1.6 million lives per year around the world. Roughly a quarter of the world's population is latently infected with Mycobacterium tuberculosis. These figures are no less than staggering, and it's not just the lives lost, it's also the economic losses that we experience as a global community that are quite staggering. 50% of households face catastrophic TB-related health expenditures, and a recent study published in The Lancet by Alison Portnoy and her colleagues have demonstrated that if there's no change to our current approach to prevention and treatment of tuberculosis, we will see $17.5 trillion in economic losses between now and 2050. if you didn't need a reason to be involved in TB until today, here's many reasons. Why do these figures persist? Well, it's a good question. Many of you here are infectious disease researchers and clinicians, and you know well how difficult it is to address the burden of tuberculosis disease. TB preventative therapy, not even TB treatment, has a really high pill burden and requires pre-screening. You'll often see TB preventative treatment being the strongest in areas where there's strong HIV programs, but outside of HIV programs, it's very difficult to find examples of very efficacious and wide-reaching programs. TB also requires TB preventative therapy is a high burden for patients, which means adherence is incredibly challenging. And there's only one registered vaccine for tuberculosis, largely addressing the burden of disease amongst children and adolescents, and that's the BCG vaccine, which I'm sure all of you have heard of, and it's been around for over 100 years. But since then, we've had no new registered vaccines. So when a call to action happens like the one you see here on the right by Jeremy Farrar, who is currently the Chief Scientific Officer at the World Health Organization, to develop novel TB vaccines in the vigorous pursuit of novel TB vaccines. What happens? The World Health Organization will often pull together a group of experts to define a preferred product characteristics list for a novel product, and in this case, for tuberculosis. And so what they set out to define, this was now 5 years ago, was what are those characteristics that will lead to the biggest impact? And this was an enormous amount of work that went into this, and I've just highlighted a couple things. This is not the full list. This is an excerpt of the entire document, but was to create a vaccine that's for the prevention of active pulmonary TB disease. So not prevention of infection necessarily, but prevention of disease for adolescents and adults with greater or equal to 50% efficacy that can be delivered in 3 or fewer doses and have at least 10 years duration of protection and a whole bunch of other considerations, including affordability. And what does the pipeline look like now? So for those of you who have been in the tuberculosis world for some time, this is actually a really welcome sight. It might not look like all that much excitement when you compare this to, for example, an oncology pipeline, which might look 400% this large. But for TB, this is a really exciting time to be in this field. There's nearly 20 new vaccines in development. And in something of a positive feedback loop that's happening, there's also a lot of traction in the global health ecosystem. The recent UN high-level meeting on tuberculosis, which happened in September in New York, called for accelerated investments in developing novel TB vaccines. The WHO just launched its new TB Vaccine Accelerator Council, which is a group of ministerial leaders and technical operators who are working towards paving the pathway for access to new TB vaccines. TB also was recently included in the Gavi Alliance's long list for vaccine investment strategy. And actually, I think it's happening today or tomorrow in Accra, Ghana, the board vote at Gavi on whether TB will be included in the short list, which is that's part of the critical path for a product like this, is whether this disease area will be included in the Gavi short list and ultimately their vaccine investment strategy for 2026 to 2030. There's a whole bunch of other investments that have been made, including USAID's $200 million for Smart for TB, which is also paving the pathway for access to product, and the WHO's continued guidance on evidence considerations for vaccine policy. So if all of these pieces come together, if that critical path is met and the product makes it through all of the checkpoints that it has to make it through, what will the impact be? Well, we know that if we do nothing, we're looking at $17.5 trillion in global economic losses and the persistence of 1.6 million deaths per year. But based on this modeling that was done by Alison Portnoy, Nick Menzies, Richard White, and their group at Harvard and the London School, they found that, that a novel TB vaccine that meets the WHO preferred product characteristics could avert up to 76 million cases of tuberculosis, up to 8.5 million deaths, reducing antimicrobial resistance by averting 42 million treatments, and leading to absolute gains in GDP of up to $3 trillion by 2050. So, how do we realize an impact potential like that? How do we, the global we, all of us sitting in this room, the global health community broadly, realize that impact? Well, we know that it takes a major effort, and we also know that future impact is driven by decisions that are made today. So I'll highlight just a couple of these elements across the cascade with a focus on financing. Am I doing okay on time? Okay. So one example here is the policy and strategy domain. So actually, let me just back up and introduce this. This is, if you remember that earlier slide with the 4 activity sets, this is a different way of looking at it and showing sort of the upstream and the downstream elements along this cascade. And again, for this, these are all interrelated. It's not necessarily that once you finish your regulatory upfront, you're done with that once you get to the end. These are all kind of happening on top of each other, but generally thought to be more of the upstream and downstream of the cascade. So I'll pull out a couple of these. And first, for policy and strategy, we've already talked about some of this, where the world will look to the World Health Organization, for example, to define those preferred product characteristics. That's one example of what happens in this domain. But another one is, how does your product fit in with the multilateral strategy prioritization? What do I mean by that? We just talked about the Gavi vaccine investment strategy. They have their own strategic planning cycle and their own replenishment cycle, where they're going to donors and asking for more funding. They're going to their board and asking for support. So how does your clinical development timeline match up with those multilateral organizations and their replenishment cycles, their board votes, and their strategic decision-making timing? So this, you'll see on the left, is a blurred out version of a clinical development timeline with an overlay of the top 3 or 4 global health normative organizations and their timing, so that you can say, well, if this organization's making a decision on X year or X date, then we need to be able to interact, engage, and provide information at these timings to ensure that they have the information that they need to make an informed decision about certain prioritizations and funding that they're going for. So this is one example of what this could look like for a given product. Then taking supply-side financing and market shaping as another example. So I think money doesn't solve every problem in market access, but it certainly does solve some. And so what we think about here a bit is, where is money going to solve some of your problems? Where is new financial architecture going to solve some of your problems? And I know Kendall has worked on this a lot with Chris Snyder. I don't know if he's in the room, but on advanced market commitments and volume guarantees and other different types of financial infrastructure that can really influence and make it possible for these products to get to market. But you have to think about it really early on, or you have to set it up so that you can get sort of day zero funding, where you tee up the negotiations in advance so that if you hit X milestone, that funding is ready to go. And this is a lot of the conversation that's happened around pandemics, but certainly could be applied to other disease areas and TB, which has been around for a gazillion years. I think that's the technical term. We could apply and think about some of those pre-negotiated deals. So I won't go into all of this. This is from a great resource at the USAID Center for Innovation and Impact, where they have a number of different access modules. This is one way that they display their market shaping entities. So let's double click now a little bit on financing. So what do we think about when we're trying to solve problems with money? We're trying to synthesize the conditions for a healthier market in a timely way that can bridge a gap between sort of the do-nothing option and a bunch of different do-something options to make sure that that product can reach its full potential. So we've talked about Gavi. There's another type of organization or financing infrastructure called the PAHO Strategic Fund. which is another procurement mechanism for Latin and South America region. And you also have different development financial institutions. I'll go into that on the next slide. You can also, look towards commercial banks, philanthropies, other market-shaping entities, U.S. Unitaid, MedAccess, and others to deploy certain types of capital or capital structures to address some of these market imperfections. So I'll just speak very briefly to an area that could have been an entire talk. I think this is a really interesting area because it's changed so much. So how do development finance institutions have anything to do with vaccines? Well, there's a number of different ways that DFIs, like the World Bank, like IFC, like EIB, like the bilaterals that each country has, the US government has the Development Finance Corporation, the US DFC, that work towards putting capital or certain financial infrastructure in place to make it possible for certain products to get to market. And so I wanted to just highlight that the trend in this space right now is shifting more into private sector investment, larger funds going to the health sector, and new types of financing mechanisms. So where we thought, or where debt financing used to be the primary traditional financing mechanism for providing access to products and providing access to capital for manufacturers in low-income countries. That still is the case, but now there's new structures in place. You can, these DFIs can allocate, can do equity deals. They can do quasi-equity deals. They can do fund-to-funds, technical assistance, upstream investments, and these are all making a really big difference in this space because now companies around the world that may not have access to commercial capital at favorable rates may now get access to blended finance and concessional loans that they wouldn't have otherwise gotten access to. So this is a space to watch with regard to the vaccines turning into vaccinations domain. I put a couple recent deal examples here of investments in two South African pharmaceutical companies that have now been able to make certain investments and growth investments that they wouldn't have otherwise been able to make potentially because they had access to this development finance capital. So further on down the line, we look at what countries will benefit most. What are your priority populations? What are the trade-offs? Do you go towards really high-risk populations, or do you do campaigns? Do you do routine immunizations? And particularly when you're thinking about a new product class, and in an adult and adolescent vaccine, as is the case with TB, for example, these questions become really important to ask early on and certainly impact your demand forecasting. So, when I think about access, and I'll close here, I really think about the aspiration and the desire to bring cutting-edge technology to people who need it around the world, and all of the work that goes into that. These are pictures I took just a couple days ago in the northern province in Rwanda, where I used to live and work, and where others of you did, including Lisa. And this is a picture of a remote hospital on a hilltop in the volcanoes region. It's called the Butaro Hospital. And it sits on an old military base. Actually, when I used to live and work there, there was still artillery. There was still military equipment on the base that had been left there since the genocide. And now this is the site of healing. This is the site of a hospital. And where there was an under-resourced small community health clinic, there is now a hospital that has a CT scanner that was just being installed when I was there on Sunday. There's oxygen being manufactured on site. That's that picture down below. There's a new imaging center. Chemotherapy is being delivered in this rural place. It took 4 hours to get there from Kigali. So how do these products get there? How do these new oxygen tanks get there? Hard work, yes, takes a lot of hard work. We've just walked through a number of the reasons why it takes hard work, but it also happens because of sustained and nurtured collaborations, because successfully bringing a product to market is never done alone. And as my old mentor and boss, Paul Farmer, said, with rare exceptions, all of your most important achievements on this planet will come from working with others, or, in a word, partnership. Thank you.